On a freezing night in Pittsburgh, robotics legend Ethan Mercer and his wife Carolyn vanish after their own protégés push a reorganization paper across the table. The company calls it a health scare. The police call it confusion. But hours later, a delivery driver hears a voice behind a locked warehouse door and finds them bleeding, erased, and set up to disappear. Then one forgotten employee badge beeps on an old reader and exposes a lie powerful people will kill to protect. What would you do if your own family stole your life? Stay to the end. Comment where you're watching from. Ethan Mercer sat at the head table like a ghost haunting the present, his gaze gliding over the sea of faces basking in champagne and fluorescent nostalgia. It was his name they were toasting, his initials still etched into the original blueprint framed near the entrance, now mostly ignored beneath newer plaques that boasted international patents and venture accolades. He nodded politely as younger engineers passed by, all pride and practiced reverence. But inside, something pulled taut beneath his ribs. His fingers curled around the stem of his glass, half listening to speeches that sounded like Wikipedia articles read aloud. Beside him, Carolyn leaned in slightly, her voice low against the hum of background laughter. "You hear how many times they've said legacy tonight?" she whispered, her tone almost playful. But Ethan caught the steel beneath it. Her instincts were rarely wrong. He offered a tight smile, then turned toward Dylan Rourke, who was already rising from his seat with the confidence of a man about to sell something disguised as sentiment. Dylan's toast came wrapped in polished charm, words like future-facing, succession, and protecting the core. Carolyn straightened in her chair. Madison Shaw slid a leather folder across the table, her fingers grazing Ethan's as she murmured, "We thought it would mean more coming from us." Grant Keller chuckled lightly, as if everything had already been agreed upon. Ethan opened the folder and saw his own name typed neatly above a clause labeled Transfer of Executive Voting Rights. Another clause outlined Carolyn's honorary role in financial advisory, a role with no binding authority. He blinked, reread it, and then looked up at their three successors with a bewildered kind of betrayal, the kind that hadn't quite found its voice yet. "You want us to sign this?" he asked, not loudly, not angrily, just enough to quiet the immediate radius around their table. Dylan didn't flinch. "It's for the good of the company, Ethan. We're under pressure from the board. This is just optics. You'd still be involved, just not operationally." Carolyn took the papers from her husband's hands, her eyes scanning faster than any lawyer could manage. She was silent for several long beats. Then, without looking up, she asked, "Is this why you stopped copying me on the financial reports?" Grant took a sip of his wine. "We thought you deserved a break," he said. "After everything." Carolyn smiled then, tight, humorless. "You're pushing out the founders under the pretense of gratitude. That's not succession. That's theft." Madison's smile faltered only briefly. "Carolyn, come on. This isn't personal. It's business. And we thought you, of all people, would understand." Carolyn closed the folder with deliberate calm, slid it back across the table, and stood. The temperature around the table dropped. No one said anything, not even Ethan, whose face had drained of color as if every vein inside him was recalibrating. He watched Dylan pick up the folder, calmly tuck it into his suit jacket and say, "Well, let's not ruin the night." Carolyn had already turned toward the coat check. Ethan followed mechanically, his hand brushing against the back of a chair that wasn't there. Around them, the celebration roared on. Laughter from the interns near the bar, the clinking of glasses, the soft rhythm of a live jazz trio hired to make everything seem less brutal. But Ethan couldn't hear any of it clearly anymore. Everything was underwater. They didn't speak as they walked past the reception desk, past the security guards who nodded without seeing them, past the building Ethan had designed from the ground up. It was only when they reached the curb that Carolyn finally turned to him, breath clouding in the night air. "I saw Grant's signature on a document 3 weeks ago," she said. "I thought it was a draft. I didn't know it was real." Ethan blinked slowly. "I did," he said, voice thin. "Part of me. I saw it coming, but I didn't stop it." Carolyn opened her mouth to respond, then hesitated. "Let's just go," she said instead. She hailed a car. They never made it home. When Ethan came to, he couldn't immediately place the pain, whether it was his head, his heart, or some dull ache behind his ribs. Cold metal scraped against his back. The air was dense with dust and engine oil. He sat up slowly and saw Carolyn across from him, still unconscious, her legs folded beneath her awkwardly as if she'd collapsed mid-step. "Carolyn," he croaked, crawling toward her. She stirred at the sound, then winced, her hand going to her mouth. Dried blood crusted along her lower lip. She blinked twice before focusing. "Where are we?" she asked hoarsely. They both looked around. High walls, no windows. One heavy door, bolted shut. The warehouse was empty except for them. Ethan checked his pockets. Empty. No phone, no wallet, not even his watch. Carolyn's purse was gone. Her coat, too. "We've been dumped," she said softly, not as a question. Ethan stood on shaking legs, staggered to the door and pounded against it with the side of his fist. "Help!" he shouted. "Someone, please!" His voice echoed back at him, useless and thin. He hit the door again harder until his knuckles split open. Then he slumped to the floor, breathing heavily, staring at his bloody hands like they were foreign. Time passed without shape. Minutes folded into themselves. Carolyn found a broken wooden crate and moved it beneath the door, hoping to reach a rusted latch. It didn't budge. She returned to Ethan, crouched beside him, and took his hand in hers, pressing gently at the torn skin. He wouldn't look at her. "They planned this," he muttered. "They rehearsed every word." Carolyn nodded once. "They had the paperwork weeks ago. I recognize Madison's formatting. She always uses some dashes where she shouldn't." Ethan let out a short, bitter laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "God. We built this, we gave them everything, and they left us here like garbage." Carolyn stayed quiet, listening not to the silence, but to the weight of what hadn't been said. "Ethan," she whispered, and he finally turned his head. "We're still here. That's the only thing that matters now. We get out. We come back. We make them look us in the eye." He stared at her, and for a moment she worried he might spiral, unravel completely. But then he nodded. Once, twice. "We live," he said. "Then we return." Carolyn squeezed his hand. "And we remind them whose name is on that goddamn wall." Outside, the world moved on without pause. A distant car passed. Somewhere a siren wailed, but none of it touched the cold cement where Ethan and Carolyn clung to each other, not as victims, but as something slowly reforming into steel. They didn't cry. They didn't scream anymore. They planned. They recounted timelines, names, details, everything they remembered about that night. Who was at the table? Who poured the drinks? The last time they saw their phones. Carolyn repeated Dylan's words until Ethan could mimic his exact cadence. Ethan listed every passcode he'd ever used for company servers, wondering which ones had already been changed. They didn't have anything yet, but they had memory, and rage, and the kind of bond you don't sign away with a smile and a pen. As the warehouse sank deeper into shadow, Carolyn pulled Ethan's coat tighter around his shoulders. He reached for her hand and held it, tight. "They think this is over," he said. Carolyn's voice was barely audible, but it carried the weight of fire. "They're wrong." Somewhere between the last laugh and the first fear, the night had fractured, and from that break something stronger had begun to take shape. Time had started to break into pieces too small to hold. Ethan sat slumped against the wall with his knees tucked up, muttering equations and mechanical jargon under his breath like a man trying to keep the edges of his mind from slipping. His voice rose and fell in rhythms that reminded Carolyn of the way he used to speak to machines during late nights in the lab. Half command, half prayer. "Pressure threshold fails at 4. Toopsie, rewire the feedback loop." "No, that's not right," he whispered, tapping the floor beside him like he was testing an imaginary circuit board. Carolyn stayed focused in a different way. She cataloged every moment from the party. Who was standing where, which wine bottles were uncorked, the exact tone of Dylan's voice when he said, "This is just for optics." Names, timestamps, gestures. She wrote them all in her head line by line, as if she were carving their truth into stone. When Ethan slipped into sleep for a few minutes, she didn't rest. She stayed awake, watching the door, repeating Dylan's closing words like a bitter chant. Let's not ruin the night. Hunger pressed hard, blurring her thoughts, and the cold had begun to creep beneath her skin like an infection. But still she waited. The sound came just after what might have been dawn, though light didn't reach inside the warehouse. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, tires crunching over gravel, then the low idle of an engine left running. Carolyn crawled to the door, pressed her face close, and listened. Ethan stirred, blinking slowly, his voice dry. "Someone?" Carolyn lifted a hand and knocked, not frantically but with rhythmic purpose. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks, pause, then again. A few seconds passed before a beam of light, narrow and hesitant, cut under the door's edge. A voice followed, tentative. "Hello?" It was a woman, young, uncertain. "Is someone in there?" Carolyn's throat was raw, but she pushed through. "Yes, please. We need help." Silence stretched, then the sound of footsteps circling the building. Ethan managed to pull himself upright just as the metal door groaned and cracked open. Light flooded in behind a figure wrapped in a faded delivery jacket, badge glinting dully in her chest. "Jesus," the woman whispered, seeing them. "What the hell happened to you two?" Her name was Riley Brooks. She looked 25 maybe, with eyes that were more tired than her age allowed. She didn't ask what they were doing there. She just stepped in, pulled off her coat, and threw it over Carolyn's shoulders. Riley moved quickly, her phone already in her hand as she backed out of the warehouse and placed the 911 call. Her voice, now steady, described what she'd found with an eerie precision. 2 adults, mid-60s maybe, conscious but injured, possible hypothermia, no signs of struggle inside, no ID. She glanced back at Ethan, who was now sitting with his head in his hands. "We need someone here now," she added before hanging up. When she returned, she knelt beside Ethan and offered a plastic water bottle, still cold from her van. "It's all I've got right now," she murmured. He took it without speaking, barely managing a nod. Carolyn gripped Riley's forearm briefly. "Thank you," she said, voice trembling for the first time. Riley swallowed hard. "I don't know what's going on," she said, "but no one ends up in a place like that by accident." Minutes later, sirens howled somewhere in the distance, closing in. Riley helped guide the paramedics in, answering their questions as best she could. Ethan and Carolyn were taken in separate ambulances. In the chaos, Riley could have slipped away, just another witness who did her part. But she didn't. She drove behind the ambulances, arriving at the hospital just as they were wheeled in. She stayed in the lobby with her arms crossed, shifting from foot to foot, unsure why she couldn't bring herself to leave. The hospital experience was not the return to safety Carolyn had hoped for. Everything was wrapped in protocol, thick with suspicion. The nurses were polite, but sterile. Ethan's vitals were checked, blood drawn, questions asked. But the most damaging wound came in the form of a clipboard and a detective whose tone bordered on dismissive. He introduced himself as Detective Larson, eyes moving over Ethan like he was a form that had already been filled in. "Mr. Mercer," he began, "do you have a history of cognitive decline? Any memory lapses in the past year?" Ethan blinked at him, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "No," he said flatly. "I've never had issues with memory. I'm not confused. We were drugged and dumped in a warehouse." Larson jotted something down. "Any possibility you wandered off? Had a medical episode?" Carolyn's eyes went sharp. "Do we look like people who wandered off and stripped ourselves of identification?" The detective raised a brow. "Sometimes in high-stress events, people make choices they can't explain afterward." Ethan clenched his jaw. "I didn't choose this." But the doubt was already there, settling into the corners of the room like mildew. Later, as they were moved to a private room, Carolyn could see Ethan sinking beneath the weight of it, humiliation, exhaustion, and the creeping fear that the truth alone wouldn't be enough. In another world, just a few blocks away, Mercer Robotics continued spinning its version of the story. Dylan's internal memo to employees used the word concern 3 times. He wrote about Ethan and Carolyn with gentle, sanitized language, describing their unexpected leave and temporary recovery period. Madison posted a video statement, polished and sincere, expressing how devastated the leadership team felt and how committed they were to carrying the vision forward. Her eyes shimmered, practiced. She didn't mention the board meeting where they'd finalized the power transfer. Grant filed new signatures with legal counsel. In official channels, the story was clean. At the hospital, the story was chaos. No fingerprints in the warehouse, no usable footage. a system that defaulted to disbelief. Riley, watching it all unfold from just outside their room, felt something she didn't have words for, like anger had tangled with responsibility. She started scrolling through her dashcam archive, her delivery app location logs, even her texts, looking for proof she'd been there. Anything that showed the timeline, anything that proved Ethan and Carolyn weren't imagining this. That night, long after visiting hours had ended, she slipped a small spiral notebook into the room. On the first page, in thick black marker, she wrote, "If they're rewriting you, we write back." Carolyn found the notebook the next morning. She opened it slowly, almost reverently, like she expected it to vanish if she blinked too hard. The words hit her like a defibrillator. She hadn't realized just how close she'd come to believing the lie, believing that maybe they had misunderstood something, missed something critical. Maybe the betrayal wasn't betrayal at all, but just business. But Riley's note was like an anchor thrown from a lifeboat. She ran her fingers across the ink as if the contact made it more real. Ethan looked up from his hospital bed and met her gaze. "She believes us," he said, barely audible. Carolyn nodded. "She does." In a world that had dismissed them so easily, this stranger, this girl who was late on deliveries and had no reason to care, had stopped, had listened, and had stayed. It shifted something fundamental. Carolyn reached for a pen, turned to the next blank page and wrote a list. Dates, names, phrases Dylan used, everything she'd memorized in the warehouse. Ethan watched her, then reached for the pen himself. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The battle had started with silence and disbelief, but now, thanks to a girl who didn't keep driving, they had a witness. And from that, they would build something real. Ethan paused in the doorway of his own home like a guest who had arrived unannounced. The lights were on, the thermostat still set to their preferences, but something essential was missing. Something human. It wasn't just the silence. It was the order. Carolyn walked ahead of him and stopped at the base of the stairs. She looked around with narrowed eyes, the way one scans a room after a break-in. She opened the drawer near the entryway and stared at the empty space where their tax documents had always been. Upstairs, files were gone. Photo albums, untouched, remained on the shelves as if to say we left the parts that won't threaten us. But the financial skeleton of their life, the living proof of how they had built their empire, was stripped clean. "They erased us," Carolyn muttered, standing in front of Ethan's office door. When she opened it, Ethan saw the same desk, the same monitor, the same chair. But the binders had been pulled, the drawers emptied, and every USB drive he'd kept labeled had vanished. "It's surgical," he said, not with shock, but resignation. It was the efficiency that hit hardest. This wasn't rage, and this was protocol. It was only when he opened the closet near the garage and reached for an old jacket that his fingers brushed something rigid and plastic. He pulled it out, a badge. His first. Mercer Robotics, Jahrbesausar 1. His own face looked back at him from 15 years ago, young, unaware, and smiling. For a long time he just stared. Riley was sitting at their kitchen table like she belonged there, legs pulled up beneath her, eating a bowl of cereal like someone who never expected an invitation but showed up anyway. She didn't speak until she saw the badge in Ethan's hands. "Is that what I think it is?" she asked, brushing a few curls from her forehead. Ethan didn't answer right away. Carolyn nodded for him. His first employee badge, the day they incorporated. Riley stood, eyes narrowing. "That thing still works?" Ethan gave a short, hollow laugh. "Doubt it. The system's been upgraded a dozen times." Riley shrugged. "You'd be surprised. Old buildings don't throw anything away. Most security teams don't even know half their backups are still live." Carolyn turned to her. "You've seen that?" Riley nodded, her voice gaining energy. "I deliver to corporate places all the time. Some of them still log RFID badges from 5 years ago. They just route it to shadow servers. Nobody checks unless something goes wrong." Ethan looked at her, and for the first time in days, a flicker of something lit in his chest. "You think Mercer's system kept that old data?" Riley met his eyes. "Only one way to find out." Carolyn was already grabbing her coat. They didn't go in through the front. They didn't need to. Carolyn knew the side door near the north stairwell had always stuck in the winter. Ethan knew where the cameras turned, when the sensors reset. how long the motion detector stayed quiet after a sweep, and Riley parked in the alley with the kind of practiced stillness that only someone used to waiting in silence could manage. Mercer Robotics was alive inside but cold in spirit. Ethan walked past a hallway lined with photographs and paused in front of one, him and Carolyn, flanked by the original engineering team, their hands still covered in grease, eyes lit with the thrill of beginnings. His own face stared back at him like a stranger. "They didn't even take this down," he whispered. "It's like they're pretending we still live here." Carolyn touched his arm. "Come on." They moved quickly, descending into a service level that most current employees didn't even know existed. The server door looked exactly as Ethan remembered, dull gray with a crusted security reader beside it. The reader was coated in dust, its lights dim but still blinking. "I don't know if I can do this," Ethan said, the badge trembling slightly in his fingers. "If it doesn't beep, then we try something else," Carolyn interrupted. She stepped close, placed her hand over his, and said softly, "But it will." Together, they swiped. A beep answered, quiet and anticlimactic, but in that moment it might as well have been an anthem. Ethan flinched like he'd been struck. Carolyn exhaled sharply. Riley, behind them, clapped once and whispered, "Told you." The door clicked open. Inside, the server room hadn't changed. Rows of dead tech, blinking lights from long-retired systems. Ethan moved to the nearest console and started scanning through logs. The timestamps were clean. The badge had been used during hours Mercer's leadership claimed he had been missing. No doubt. No debate. Proof. Carolyn stepped beside him and began snapping photos with her phone, cataloging every frame. Riley sent the files to her sister, who connected them to a lawyer named Vanessa Park, a former public defender who had turned to civil litigation. Vanessa didn't flinch when she saw the evidence. "This is real," she said after a long silence. "Not just circumstantial. Time-stamped logs. Entry data. It'll crack the timeline wide open." Carolyn showed her the emails, calendar invites, the metadata of the reorganization file that predated Dylan's official concerned memo. Riley added her dashcam footage, the exact GPS ping of where she found them. It all began to stack, layer by layer. Vanessa looked at them with cool eyes and said, "I won't promise you a win, but I can promise I won't blink." The case moved, but time did not heal. Ethan wandered the house like a man rebuilding his own history, one blueprint at a time. Some days he stared at engineering plans without seeing them. Other days, he tore them up. Carolyn stayed grounded by keeping busy, calling Vanessa, organizing documents, verifying every thread of their story. She became a weapon sharpened by betrayal, but she watched Ethan closely. He was quieter now, not broken, just emptied. "You think they ever cared about us?" he asked one night while holding the badge at the table like a prayer token. "I taught Dylan how to write his first prototype script. I showed Madison how to negotiate with VCs. Grant used to call me Uncle E." Carolyn sat across from him, her eyes steady. They cared, and then they stopped. And that's what makes it unforgivable. Riley came by every day now. At first it was under the excuse of just checking in, but soon she became part of the rhythm, bringing groceries, double-checking file dates, sitting beside Ethan in silence when he couldn't speak. Carolyn added her to the emergency contact list without telling her. Ethan saved her number under Witness 1, but the name never felt right. She wasn't a witness anymore. She was proof of something else, that trust could still grow in the ruins. On the kitchen counter, beside a stack of labeled folders and Vanessa's handwritten notes, Ethan placed the badge. Every morning, he looked at it before doing anything else. Not because it gave him hope, but because it reminded him that the past could fight back. That memory had weight when backed by evidence. Carolyn touched it too, sometimes in passing, the way one brushes against a relic in a museum that still carries heat. They weren't healed, but they were active. They were dangerous now, in the way people are when they've stopped asking for permission. Riley, once an accidental savior, now existed in the marrow of their days. She was there when Vanessa filed the first injunction. She was there when the media started circling, when press statements were drafted, when the narrative began to shift. Ethan watched it happen without celebration. Carolyn did too. They both knew this wasn't a victory. It was preparation. The real fight was still coming. But now they had a weapon. Not just the badge, not just the logs, not just the lawyer. They had each other, and they had someone who hadn't been there from the beginning but had chosen to stay. As the evening fell, Ethan stood at the counter, touched the badge once more, and finally said aloud, "The system remembers me." The courthouse smelled like bureaucracy and old paper, but the cold that pressed against Ethan's chest had nothing to do with the weather. He stood beside Carolyn in the corridor, watching Dylan, Madison, and Grant approach from the opposite end, like a parade of impunity. They looked flawless. Grant in tailored navy, Madison in muted gray, Dylan with that same cool, clean confidence he'd always wielded like armor. Not one of them looked toward Ethan or Carolyn. Not one flinched. It wasn't anger that struck Ethan. It was something far worse. Erasure. He wasn't a betrayed mentor or a wounded patriarch. He was a mistake they'd rewritten into a footnote. Carolyn's fingers laced into his with pressure, grounding him. "They see us," she whispered. "They just won't admit it." Ethan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. As the bailiff called them in, the echo of his name down the hallway sounded less like a summons and more like a dare. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with the weight of silence waiting to be broken. Ethan scanned the room, wood paneling rows of neutral faces, and understood with aching clarity. This wasn't just about justice. It was about reclaiming authorship over a story someone else had hijacked. Carolyn took the stand first. She didn't dress herself in drama, didn't raise her voice or twist her words for effect. She simply told the truth in the same clear tone she'd once used to close deals worth millions. "They called it protection," she said, lifting the original folder Vanessa had submitted into evidence. "They told us it was about legacy, but when I read the language, I knew what it really was. A transfer of control." Her eyes met Madison's across the room. She called me Mom while sliding the pen into my hand, over and over again. Like affection would dull my judgment. The courtroom didn't react. Not yet. The judge remained still. The defense attorneys, poised and sleek, leaned forward. When their turn came, they didn't challenge the facts. They challenged the framing. "Mrs. Mercer," one of them began, "is it possible you misinterpreted the document under stress? Perhaps due to pre-existing marital strain?" Carolyn didn't blink. "No." Another leaned in. "Is it true your husband has been less active in the company in recent years?" Carolyn nodded. "He was mentoring, delegating, not disappearing." Her voice only cracked once, but not at the challenge. It cracked when she named them. Dylan, Madison, Grant, and followed it quietly, painfully with, "I loved them." That sentence landed harder than any accusation, because love, when offered without defense, made the betrayal undeniable. When Ethan stood, the courtroom shifted. Not physically, not with gasps or murmurs, but with a tension that sharpened like a blade. He didn't carry notes, just the old badge in his hand, worn plastic glinting faintly under the overhead lights. "This," he said, holding it up, "was the first thing I made for this company that had my name on it." He let it hang there a moment. "It's also the only thing that still recognizes me." His voice wavered but didn't break. "I used to sleep under my own desk. I built the first prototype in a garage with a soldering iron from Home Depot. I gave Dylan his first real job. I trained Madison in how to negotiate with venture capitalists. I drove Grant to his father's funeral when he couldn't afford the flight." He paused. "If they'd asked me to step aside, I would have done it, proudly. If they'd told me they needed space to lead, I would have made room." His eyes settled on each of them in turn. But they didn't ask. They took. Vanessa stood then and submitted the security logs, the RFID data, Riley's dash cam, the vehicle pings, the metadata from the fake concern memo. The silence in the courtroom changed. It wasn't polite anymore. It was stunned. Truth, stamped with time. The verdict didn't erupt, it fell. Guilty of misconduct, liable for damages, removed from corporate control. The ruling came down with the weight of law, but Ethan didn't feel a surge of victory. He felt empty, like the roof had been fixed but the storm had already hollowed the walls. Carolyn stood still as the judge read the statement, her hand tight in his. When it was over, reporters waited outside with microphones and questions, but Ethan turned away. He had no interest in sound bites. Carolyn stopped just long enough to say one sentence, "We told the truth," then followed him. Riley flanked them quietly, watching the crowd like someone expecting a second betrayal. That night at home, they didn't toast. They didn't speak much at all. Carolyn found the small spiral notebook Riley had left months ago and opened to a blank page. Slowly, deliberately, she wrote, "We are here." Beneath it, she wrote Riley's name in thick ink. Then, with a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, added a line that surprised even her. "Family isn't blood. It's the one who stops." When she showed it to Ethan, he touched her hand and nodded. The notebook remained open on the table between them until long after midnight. Weeks passed, but the momentum didn't stop. Instead of retreating into silence or licking wounds in private, Ethan and Carolyn made a choice that surprised even themselves. They founded the Mercer Foundation, not to capitalize on their pain, but to redirect it. The purpose was simple and urgent: protect people who didn't have the platform to shout. They launched scholarship programs for aspiring engineers with no access to mentors. They funded legal aid for workers and elderly clients manipulated into signing their lives away. And they created a hotline, not staffed by call center interns but by people who had been there, people who understood what it meant to be doubted. The launch event wasn't lavish. It took place in a community center that smelled faintly of paint and coffee. No press, no catered spread, just people. Riley stood in the back, watching as Ethan quietly pinned his old badge to a bulletin board already populated by ID tags from scholarship recipients. He didn't give a speech. He just pressed the plastic into the cork and stepped away. Carolyn, watching him, finally allowed herself to feel something close to peace. Not joy, peace. The kind that came from knowing their history wouldn't just survive. It would protect. When the crowd dispersed, Riley hovered by the exit like someone not sure if she still belonged. Her hands were in her pockets, her shoulders tense. She looked like she might bolt any second. Carolyn crossed the room without a word and placed something in her hand. A house key. No ribbon. No grand gesture. Just a real physical key, warm from being held. Riley looked down at it, stunned, and then up at Carolyn. "You sure?" she asked, her voice soft. "I didn't do that much." Carolyn smiled. "You didn't leave. That was enough." Ethan approached and said nothing at first, just placed a hand on Riley's shoulder, firm and steady. "You're part of this, whether you want it or not." Riley stared at the key again, then curled her fingers around it slowly, like accepting a name she hadn't known was hers. Outside, the Pittsburgh wind hadn't changed, still sharp, still biting, but inside something had shifted. Not fixed, not healed completely, but different. The three of them stood in the quiet, a silence that no longer hurt. And for the first time since the night of that toast, Ethan felt his chest loosen. The company might never feel like home again, but home, slowly, stubbornly, had begun to exist again anyway.